We got one more story. It's not a big news story, but I really want to talk about it because it actually happened a few years ago, and it was kind of like an exploitation of Vice and how Vice turned from this like edgy punk rock magazine into this ultra woke. Like it is a complete inversion from where it was.
Yeah.
So I have this story. I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to show you so that you understand what I'm talking about. Because I was having a conversation with the production chimp earlier about I'm kidding, but about I'm going to tell you guys the reference. The chimp is a reference to the Joe Rogan podcast parody where Joe Rogan has a chimp on as his guest, and he's like, I'm a big fan of your work, and the chimp just shrieks, and then he's like, that's crazy, and the chimp goes nuts. So that's the joke. Anyway, we were talking about how Vice had this thing called a non-traditional workplace agreement. And this is a story from 2017. Variety reported, Vice investigating sexual harassment claims defends non-traditional workplace employment contract. This contract was basically weaponized against Vice. And I don't want to read the whole thing, but actually let me read a little bit for you. They say this. It's Vice promotes an environment of free speech, encourages employees to be creative in all respects, with respect to the content of its magazine, advertising, yada yada, due to the nature of their business operations, including but not limited to, there could be sexually provocative, other explicit images, videos and audio recordings are regularly present. Individuals employed by Vice must be conscious of Vice's non-traditional environment and comfortable with exposure to and participation in situations that may present themselves during this course of their employment while working at Vice. I acknowledge that I may be exposed to highly provocative material, some of it containing extremely explicit sexual and controversial content. If I travel offsite for projects and perform work on locations, I will be confronted with unique and unusual situations which may be considered offensive, indecent, or unacceptable by others. So basically, I'm pretty sure I signed this agreement. I'm pretty sure they made me do it back when I joined.
Well, I mean, it makes sense, but it feels like it's so gray. Like it could, like anything could have applied to that, you know?
Well, here's the problem, man. Like, what's a good story? I mean, remember when like who was that celebrity? She was getting out of the car and like she wasn't wearing underwear, and a camera caught her.
Britney Spears?
Was it? Maybe.
I think.
Or like Janet Jackson and like Justin Timberlake ripped off. That was like 20 years ago, by the way.
Yeah.
But like he rips off her top or whatever. If you work in media, this completely makes sense.
Yeah.
So what's interesting to me is like, if I'm talking to somebody, the news I do, they talk about Donald Trump. Let's use Donald Trump as an example. They say the leaked audio tape where he said, grab him by the pussy.
Okay.
Can I not say that word? Would
I don't know.
If I'm in an office and someone says, "Oh, I don't like you talking about those things. It's sexually explicit."
But you're actually quoting the president. Is that what you're saying?
No, I mean like it's news.
Right.
You work for Vice.
Yeah.
So here's what I'm trying to say. Like I think one of the things that destroyed Vice, and I've talked to some of the former higher ups, like why they went from being this dark and edgy and fun,
Yeah.
to like morally outraged, indignant feminism.
Yeah, it really did change, didn't it?
Totally changed. So like, here's the example I give everybody. There was an article that was written that said this horrifying app can show you any woman's like breast or something like that. You can Google search it.
Okay.
And I looked at that and I was like, what's crazy? In 2011, the title of that article would have been, "This amazing app can show you any woman topless." Right? The tone was totally flipped. It used to be like, we don't care. We eschew the norms. We're edgy bad boys. And now it's like, oh, harumph, I say. Well, I never. Why would they make such an app? And I was wondering why that happened. I started talking to somebody, and this kind of came up, and this was weaponized against Vice, basically saying it was proof of how when the people at Vice, they really did get accused of like, Me Tooing some women. And I'll tell you this true.
That's the gray area I was talking about, because the way this is written, it's not. It's almost like it's not necessarily saying that it's going to be, the content that they're going to, it's going to be the only
It's not
thing.
the content.
I know, exactly. It's like, it's like
when you go,
it's weird. It's a gray.
But look, if you go to Japan,
Mm-hmm.
and they did a doc on this like 5-story sex shop.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's not just the content. It's literally you're going to a sex shop.
Right.
So what ends up happening is They said this is proof that like the people at Vice thought they could do whatever they wanted because they had agreements signed. But I think there's a clear, delineation between you are working on a job that talks about and explores these issues and some dude assaulting you or threatening your job or something.
Yeah, that's true.
So what ends up happening is they do this because it makes sense. Like, come on, man. If we're literally talking about this subject and I'm saying the word sex and talking about Trump, what happens if someone I hire says, I don't like it when you use the word pussy. Can you not say that? Because it's like...
It makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, and as a woman, and then I've been warned. And then what? I get sued for sexual harassment for talking about genitals? But it's
when
news.
You're actually reporting the news.
Right. So it's like, what would happen if... I don't know if you heard the story, but there was an executive at Netflix who was explaining to people racial slurs.
Oh, yeah, I heard about that.
He got fired because he explained that the N-word was offensive. Or, you know what? I will never eat Papa John's. Yes. You know why?
Why?
They fired John Schnatter, Papa John himself, because on a phone call he said, why is it that, Colonel Sanders can say the N-word, but he actually said the N-word, and, like, nobody says anything, but, now everyone's freaking out. He was basically complaining there's a double standard.
Yeah.
And somebody on the call was like, aha, he said the word. And they removed the guy from everything.
That's crazy.
I'm like, that's crazy. Look, I'm not saying I'm a fan of Papa John's or the guy. I'm just like, that's crazy.
Yeah, that's a little too much.
I got to be honest. I'll probably eat Papa John's. I really don't care.
Yeah,
it's a pizza shop.
But
you know what I mean?
That's that thing. It's that
I
we
like
were talking
stuffed
about
crust though,
yesterday.
anyway. So
it's just people going nuts for no reason, just because they think someone else is going to be offended.
For leverage. But so I want to talk about this because I'm like, what am I supposed to do? I can't have this agreement. Vice. So here's basically here's what I wanted to bring up. I think this is exactly what caused Vice, or one of the moments that caused it to flip and become something completely different from when I worked there. When I joined, it was actually at this transitional period where people stopped, they were actually getting rid of the old school punk rock people who got paid dirt and bringing on real traditional corporate employees. I remember it was I'm not going to name anybody. There was one person who was very obviously just in the job because they had always had the job. Mm-hmm. Like when Vice was very scrappy, they brought in whoever was willing to do a certain job.
Yeah.
10 years later, they're like, we can afford to hire a legit corporate, person.
Yeah.
And so they would do this. But they'd always been accused of being a boys club. And then once the assault started getting reported, and I'll say this too, my understanding is I heard all these stories too. And some of these people I know and I trust and I believe.
I mean, you worked for Vice a while back. Was it a boys club? You were working there almost. It feels like during the transition to the newer Vice.
It's one of the well, yes.
Yeah.
It was like, just around the time I had joined, Shane, the CEO, would literally sit in the same room as everybody else.
Okay.
But around the time, within those next few weeks, he was on flights. He was never around. Mm-hmm. Then they built him. He built a private office that he was in, doors closed, and now he was it used to be, you'd walk in and you'd see the C-suite guys sitting in the same room as everybody else.
Is this when they were in Williamsburg?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think they still technically are.
Probably have.
They moved to a new building though.
Yeah.
But so I was talking to somebody, and I'm really hoping they would come on, the show, and we could do a big long thing about the media. Mm-hmm. It's a friend of mine who was relatively high up, telling me that with things like this non-traditional workplace agreement, with the accusations against some of these employees, which, I'll say this too, these assault claims, I personally believe them, not all of them necessarily, but I know some of them. I know some of these people and I trust them. So this created investor pressure. And what I was told was that for Vice, they had this moment where the investors came in and said, I don't know about all at the same time, but the investors basically said, listen, you are being accused by all of these women of doing these things. We don't want to lose our investment. The only way out of this is if Vice embraces wokeness or feminism, because then we can say it's not a boys club. Look, we're all about, protecting women and marginalized peoples. And so because of the investors, the people at Vice were like, okay.
All right, we'll do that.
We'll do it. And now all of a sudden you have a company that, I'll tell you what, it's mind blowing to me to see the people at Vice News today versus the people when I was there. So I was the first Vice News person, and Shane's words, it was because of me they decided to create Vice News as it is today, as an actual field reporting news thing. There's a complicated history that I probably don't know a lot about. I know that they wanted to do some kind of channel for Vice News that was basically, I probably shouldn't say too much because I don't want to infringe on anybody's privacy rights or anything, but the iteration where they went on the ground reporting like they do today was me. And
like
so
like the HBO show?
the Vice News HBO show, not the Vice one. That one preceded me.
Yeah, yeah.
So the Vice on HBO was different. It was a news magazine. So here's actually a really good point. The original Vice show, which is now on Showtime, I guess, is not news relevant. That was the point.
Oh, okay.
So initially the idea was like, we'll go interview a guy who makes bulletproof clothing. Has nothing to do with politics, news.
Right.
It was an interesting news story.
Right.
When they would do stories that were relevant to the news cycle, like protests in Spain or something, they would brand it Vice News, but it wasn't an official vertical, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it wasn't something they actually cared to do.
Okay.
I actually had to negotiate them for a long time to convince them. And then under Vice.com, I went to Venezuela, I went to Ukraine, I went to Brazil, and actually did field reporting and Turkey. And then from there, they were like, okay, we're going to launch a new channel specifically for this kind of news reporting.
Yeah.
The people we brought on were like legit reporters.
And they had you sign this back then?
I'm pretty sure I did sign this.
How long do you think they've been doing this? Like from the get-go?
From the get-go. Well, maybe not necessarily. But it got to a point, man, I left. I was there for just over a year, close to a year and a half. I left and I joined Fusion, which it's a weird thing happened, and it was a big mistake. When I joined, so I was at Vice, and for the most part, it was, kind of straight. Like nobody told me what I could or couldn't do for the most part. Like obviously, if I was like, hey, I want to go fly to Antarctica, they're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
But it's like, hey, here's a big thing. Here's my raise, and they say, great, you're good to go.
Yeah.
And so by the time I was leaving, I could feel it becoming more and more corporate. And so I was like, you know what, man? I'm going to sit here. The pay is not that great. I'm not one of these cultists. You know what I mean? There's a lot of people who are all about just being at Vice, no matter what.
I'm cool. I work at Vice.
And so
I live in Williamsburg.
Right. And I'm like, dude, you make $30,000 a year. Don't spend $1,000 a month on rent. Were you nuts?
Yeah.
And they're like, but I want to live in Williamsburg and go to the bar. And then complain about how I can't afford to travel the world and be a journalist. Don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
So I ended up getting an offer from the Disney company. It was the ABC Univision company, Fusion.
Yeah.
And they told me, what you're doing with Vice News is epic. We want to do that here too. And I said, great. Here's what I want. I want a budget. I want a staff. They gave me everything, right? 6 months later, they said, we've decided to go completely woke, feminist, far left. And I'm just like, why? And so that completely
was right
marginalized
when
me.
we were trying to do this show, right?
It was like
It was right after that.
no, it was like a year. It was a year later because
Yeah.
I moved to Miami,
Right.
and then you came down. Yeah, so Adam ends up moving down to Miami with me, and we were trying to figure out how we can do something like this. Now I have more capability to do it.
Yeah.
My own company, things are going well. We expanded this, the space and everything.
Here we are.
And I got to be honest too, like I have no idea what we're doing, but it's fun to talk.
Randomly, yesterday we were talking about YouTubers or the moderators having to sign that thing for PTSD.
Right.
And I figured, like, I don't see PTSD in here, but I feel like this would be, it should be included in that also. Like, that's basically what it's saying. It's
here's the main point I want to bring up with this non-traditional workplace agreement. Let me show everyone just again, so for those that are just tuning in, you might see what we're actually talking about. It is a single page contract. It says, I have voluntarily accepted my employment with Vice. I agree to hold Vice harmless from any and all claims I may have based upon Vice's workplace environment or my exposure to specific text, images, or information in the course of my employment with Vice. If at any time in the future I believe that the workplace environment at Vice has become offensive, I will inform Human Resources immediately. So here's the thing. We're in this world now where nobody wants to deal with the PR issue. So something weird happened. When I was going to work for Fusion, they said, like, one of their flagship show was called Drug Wars, and it was like tracking military efforts against the cartels.
Yeah.
Very much like Vice.
I remember that.
And it was always their biggest show. I joined them. I say, here's what we're going to do. We started doing it. And then for some reason, 6 months later, they were like, we've decided we're a progressive company. They used to have posters on the wall that said, we will not be partisan. We are not left, we are not right. And all of a sudden now, that all changed.
Yeah.
Well, guess what happens when you come to me and say, hey, Tim, by the way, we want you to push this.
Not going to happen.
Like, is it true?
Is it true? Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
It's not. Sorry.
Yeah.
So eventually I end up in a house in Miami with you, and we're sitting there like, what should we do?
What
like,
do we do with
if
ourselves?
they don't want me to do work because, it was really funny. I'd pitch stuff. They'd be like, well,
yeah, I remember. That's
it's about trans kids.
That's what they said to us when we were sitting there in the
Right.
business meeting with them.
Oh man, yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
we met the owner.
Right, that's right.
The
And we
president.
were talking about doing a show.
Yeah, he was about it.
Yeah.
And then that was it.
Yep.
It's like, all right.